In 5000 BBY, the Sith returned to the Republic for the first time in millennia in the Great Hyperspace War, a surprise assault on the core worlds that nearly saw the Sith Empire topple the Galactic Senate. But the Sith lost that war, and their forces were further ravaged by infighting between Dark Lords Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh, dooming the whole Sith Empire. In this chapter in the history of the Sith, we'll be telling the story of how the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War destroyed the ancient Sith, and of how the teachings of the Sith survived to curse a new generation.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Great Hyperspace War ended with the Battle of Korriban, in which the forces of Naga Sadow destroyed Ludo Kresh and his followers, but were then wiped off the map by Empress Teta. But Supreme Chancellor Poltimo of the Galactic Senate was unwilling to let things end there. He ordered the mobilization of the entire Republic Navy for a full-scale invasion of Sith space. Accompanied by the Jedi, the forces of the Republic were ordered to completely dismantle the Sith Empire. The invasion couldn't have come at a worse time for the Sith. They barely had a fleet left to defend their skies with, and many Massassi Sith adepts and war beasts had died in the Great Hyperspace War. Ludo Kresh was dead, as were many other Sith Lords, and Naga Sadow had vanished. As we discussed in the last episode, he had fled to Yavin 4, though a tomb in the Valley of the Dark Lords was still sealed in his honor. Sith Lord Shah Darkhan, who had been Naga Sadow's second in command, became acting Dark Lord of the Sith, but he proved unable to rally the remaining forces of the doomed Sith Empire. As the Republic invasion began, Shah Darkhan ordered the Massassi to fight to the last man, which held the Republic back for a time and allowed many factions of the Sith to flee the Sith Empire entirely. But before long, the might of the Republic and the Jedi proved too much even for the blind battle fury of the Massassi. After a few years of fighting, the Sith Empire ceased to exist, and virtually all of the Sith worlds were rendered depopulated ruins. Neither the Republic nor the Jedi carried out a genocide of the Sith, as is sometimes claimed, but nonetheless, the campaign all but eradicated the Sith purebloods. Those Sith who didn't fight to the death killed themselves in mass ritual suicides, depopulating their homeworlds one by one. By the time the Republic had won, it seemed that there wasn't a single Sith left alive in the entire Empire. Ziost, Korriban, and many other worlds were left desolate, home only to beasts and the crumbling ruins of the once mighty Sith Empire. Many Sith remnants escaped this bloodbath, however. Some Sith fled to distant Tund, a world the Dark Lords had used as a prison for heretics, while others fled to Thule, a Sith fortress world home to a community of elite Massassi just outside the Stygian Caldera. Others still regrouped on the acidic Republic world Vujun, where they intermarried with local human aristocrats and secretly passed Sith teachings onto new generations. Naga Sadow, as we mentioned last episode, retreated to Yavin 4 with a ship full of Massassi warriors, and there was evidence that another, more radical faction of the Sith had gathered large numbers of Sith purebloods at Malachor 5 before fleeing into the unknown regions. Despite the existence of these many holdouts, the Republic and the Jedi Order had nonetheless dealt a near fatal blow to the Sith. Their empire was gone, their base of power was shattered, and many of their teachings and artifacts were lost thanks to the Jedi Shadows, who combed the ruins of Sith worlds for any trace of the Sith teachings. The Jedi destroyed a great deal, hoping to prevent future Darksiders from learning the ways of the Sith, though they also preserved many holocrons and scrolls in the vaults of the Great Library on Ossus and the Galactic Museum on Coruscant. But though Jedi were able to all but vanquish the Sith, the dark side wouldn't remain dormant forever. Some of the Sith holdouts planned an immediate counterattack against the Republic, with the most notable being the one masterminded by Ludo Kresh's son, Elcho. Having built a fleet of pirates and mercenaries, Krath the Younger sought revenge against the Republic, but the night before the attack was to begin, he partied too hard and died of a ruptured stomach, and his followers abandoned the attempt. The other Sith were smart enough to realize that they would be unable to get their revenge anytime soon, and so, instead, they opted to bide their time, waiting for what they saw as the inevitable resurgence of the dark side. They waited for centuries, and in this time, some of the Sith remnants dissolved, as happened on Vajun and Tund. But on Thule and Yavin 4, the Massassi and their remaining leaders waited patiently for their chance at revenge. On Yavin, where the Dark Lord of the Sith himself still lived, Naga Sadow's followers built great temples in the forest where their master spent years continuing his studies into Sith alchemy. After several decades of this, Sadow ended up placing himself into suspended animation, vowing to awaken when the dark side had returned. Naga Sadow slept for over 500 years, until a young Jedi named Freedon Nadd arrived on Yavin. Freedon Nadd was a prodigy. Early in his training, the Jedi Masters on Ossus recognized that he was incredibly strong in the Force, more so than any other student they had seen for centuries. Nadd had a gift, and he knew it, dreaming of becoming the greatest Jedi that had ever lived. But the Jedi Masters saw his pride, and they refused to make Nadd a Jedi Knight until he learned humility. Freedon Nadd was outraged by this, and in his arrogance, he believed the Jedi were deliberately holding him back for fear of his power. In a fit of rage, he killed his master and abandoned the Order. Still furious at the Jedi, Freedon Nadd vowed to learn the ways of the Sith out of spite. He traveled to the ruins of Sith space, and on the Sith world Ashas Re, he discovered an artifact that the Jedi had missed, the holocron of the ancient King Adas. Nadd learned much of the dark side from Adas's holocron, and in Sith space, he also found clues that led him to Yavin 4. Nadd traveled to the Forest Moon, where he was attacked on sight by the Massassi. However, Nadd was able to hold his own, and the Massassi eventually relented, allowing him to access their temples. There, Nadd discovered and awakened Naga Sadow, who took the young Dark Jedi as an apprentice. Naga Sadow taught Freedon Nadd everything he knew, and Nadd spent years on Yavin 4 learning from the Dark Lord. Eventually, however, Sadow had nothing left to teach Nadd, and so the Dark Jedi killed his master, usurping the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. Freedon Nadd abandoned Yavin and returned to Republic space, looking for a world of his own to conquer. Ultimately, he settled on Onderon. Onderon was a jungle world dominated by vicious beasts, home to only a single settlement, the walled city of Aziz. The city had been built by a group of human settlers that had crashed on the planet, who had been forced to stick together to survive the dangers of the jungles. Centuries later, even after Aziz had blossomed into a fully fledged civilization, the city was still an island of safety on a wild world. 4,400 years before the Battle of Yavin, using the power of the dark side and the promise of more advanced technology, Freedon Nadd conquered Aziz, overthrowing the existing government and setting himself up as an absolute monarch. Freedon Nadd's reign as King of Aziz was long and brutal. He transformed Onderonian society, deeply embedding Sith teachings and ideology into the planet's culture and national consciousness, allowing him to keep the people of Aziz in line despite his brutality. All those who dared resist Freedon Nadd were cast out of Aziz to fend for themselves in the jungles. This was deemed the same as a death sentence on Aziz, but some of these exiled rebels managed to survive by taming Onderon's ferocious beasts. They became the Beast Riders, a rival society that opposed the Sith and the dark side, and they waged war against Aziz. The conflict between the Naddists and the Beast Riders lasted for decades, and the situation on the planet worsened until finally, after more than a century of Nadd's tyranny, the Jedi caught wind of what was happening on Onderon and intervened. In the pitched battle that followed, many Jedi were slain, but in the end, Freedon Nadd, King of Aziz and Dark Lord of the Sith, was defeated. The death of Freedon Nadd ended an unbroken chain of Dark Lords of the Sith that had been maintained since Ajunta Pal, and the Jedi believed that it would mean the end of the dark side's influence on Onderon. But the threat of Freedon Nadd didn't end with his death. Nadd's spirit lived on, and in the ensuing centuries, it continued to exert influence over Aziz. Subsequent Onderonian monarchs were directly descended from Nadd, and they continued to serve the dark side in secret, guided by the spectre of their dead ancestor. Aziz, as a whole, remained dominated by Naddist ideology and practices, though the Onderonians kept this a secret. It was during this period after the death of Freedon Nadd that the dark side steadily began to rise again in the greater galaxy. In 4250 BBY, there was even a third great schism in the Jedi Order, though this conflict was resolved quickly as the Dark Jedi all accidentally destroyed themselves and an entire star system in the Volta Cataclysm that same year. But Onderon remained the heart of this new rising tide of darkness, and in 4000 BBY, it laid the groundwork for the resurgence of the Sith. The Jedi and the Republic were unaware of the continued rule of the Naddists, but the Beast Riders were not. They continued their wars with Aziz, seeking to unseat Nadd's descendants. By 4000 BBY, the Beast Wars of Onderon had intensified to such a point that Queen Aminoa, despite being a Naddist, requested Jedi intervention, painting the Beast Riders as lawless raiders preying on an innocent civilization. Jedi Master Arca Jeth dispatched a team of apprentices led by Qel-Droma to help resolve the conflict, and the Jedi initially bought into Aminoa's story, especially after her daughter, Princess Gallia, was abducted by the Beast Riders. But when the Jedi tried to rescue Gallia, they learned the truth of the situation. Gallia, it turned out, had willingly defected to the Beast Riders. She planned to marry Oron Kira, the Beast Riders' own prince, and then overthrow her Naddist mother. The Jedi ultimately agreed to help the Beast Riders overthrow Aminoa, and with the last-minute help of Arca Jeth, they were successful. Aminoa was slain, and Gallia and Oron Kira became the new monarchs of Onderon. But not even this was enough to drive the dark side from Onderon. 2 years later, the Jedi attempted to relocate the sarcophagi of Freedon Nadd and Queen Aminoa to Duxon, Onderon's fourth moon, only to be met with a mass uprising of Naddists in Aziz. Led by King Omin, Aminoa's presumed dead husband, and the Dark Jedi Wab Null, the Naddists took back the sarcophagi and attempted to recapture Aziz. However, the Jedi called in support from the Republic and the rest of the Order, allowing them to put down the Naddist revolt. Wab Null was slain by Qel-Droma, who refused to grant the Dark Jedi mercy after defeating him, and in the end, King Omin was slain as well. Their spirits, and that of Freedon Nadd, were all banished to Duxon. But during the Naddist revolt, 2 visitors had managed to slip into Aziz, hoping to meet with King Omin. They were cousins Satal and Ali Makito, both aristocrats from Koros Major in the recently renamed Empress Teta system. They were also the leaders of a dark side cult called the Krath, and they revered the Sith, collecting all the Sith lore and artifacts they could get their hands on. Both were gifted with the Force, and they sought to learn Sith techniques from Omin. The spirit of Freedon Nadd saw great potential in the young Force adepts, and he instructed Omin to give them a bunch of Sith scrolls and artifacts, including a powerful amulet that had once belonged to Naga Sadow. Nadd helped the cousins escape Aziz before his banishment by the Jedi. Even as Onderon was freed from the dark side's grip, the Ketos returned to their home system. There, they and their Krath followers learned many ancient Sith techniques from the scrolls they had taken on Onderon. The dark side was still only growing stronger, and it wouldn't be long before the Dark Lords of the Sith returned. But that's a story for another time, namely next week when we continue our series on the history of the Sith. But what do you think? Would you like to see more content about Freedon Nadd in the future? What are you thinking about our series so far? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.